Alright, this is Double Dragon, an arcade classic. This game came out in 1987 in the arcades, developed by Technos Japan. And, this game was really far ahead of its time. It started the kind of beat-em-up genre as we know it today. There were games prior to this. In fact, Technos of Japan had basically their spiritual successor to this game is Renegade. And I've got Renegade on the NES. The graphics are much more primitive. There's not, as many moves. You can't pick up weapons, for example. But it's still a pretty neat game. You can definitely see some resemblances to Double Dragon. But what they did with Double Dragon, the ability to, gain more moves as you go through the game and pick up weapons from enemies off the ground is what really made this game so great. And we saw, the same formula used in so many games. I mean, I love the Streets of Rage games, and, it's so clear that there would be no Streets of Rage games if it weren't for Double Dragon, because, the premise is really identical. Now, this is the NES version, and this is the first version of this game that I ever played. This game was ported to the NES in 1988, so a year after it came out in the arcades. We saw it on the NES, and unfortunately, there's a lot of stuff taken out on the NES version. Obviously, the graphics are nowhere near as good as the arcade version, but I still think they're really good. In fact, this game for its time on the NES was one of the great-looking NES games. I really do like the graphic style in this game on the NES. Even though it's not quite like the arcade, and in some ways I actually like it better. Has a really cool look to it. And same with the music. It's got really good music on the NES, as you've already heard. But the things they took out on the NES is really what hurts it. I wouldn't say it's technical limitations to the NES. It's probably more this engine on the NES. But they really can only have two enemies on screen at the time. And the two-player cooperative mode, which was awesome in the arcades, right? You had two players where you could play together, like you would expect in a beat-em-up game like this, right? You think Streets of Rage and all these kind of games, and you want to go through them with two players. And that was how it was in the arcades, but on the NES, they actually took out the cooperative two-player mode once again because they couldn't get enough sprites on the screen. If they could only get two enemy sprites on the screen at a time, what's going to happen when they have a second player on the screen? And there's already a lot of flicker in this game, as it is. So, I don't know. The engine really wasn't probably the best engine for the NES, and I'm sure that things got improved by the second Double Dragon. But not having the co-op two-player really hurts this game. Now, a year later, this game was ported to the Sega Master System. Now, Sega actually acquired the rights to develop the port themselves. It came out for the Mark III in Japan, and then the Sega Master System. And actually, cool thing is, this game supports FM. So if you have the Japanese Master System or the European Master System, you'll get the FM sound, or you could buy it for the Japanese Mark III. But more importantly, with the Sega Master System version, it was more accurate to the arcades. According to most people, the graphics are better on the Sega Master System version. They're more colorful. Once again, I don't know, I do like the way the NES version looks, so, maybe technically the Sega Master System version does look a little bit better, but it's not that noticeable. But they did fix some of the other problems with the NES version on the Sega Master System. Instead of only 2 enemy sprites on the screen at once, now you could have 3. So it's a little bit more like the arcade in that regards. You could have more enemies on the screen at once. And they had the cooperative, simultaneous 2-player cooperative mode in it. So a lot of people prefer the Sega Master System version. A lot of people have told me the Sega Master System version's better, you know, especially if you really like the arcade game. And yes, it is a little bit more accurate to the arcade, having more enemies on screen at once, and having the 2-player. I mean, if you want to buy this game for 2-player, you're definitely going to buy the Sega Master System version. But, I mean, overall, I still think I'd prefer the NES version. I don't know if it's just me, but I find it a little bit easier to control. I find it a little bit easier overall. And, I don't know, maybe it's just nostalgic for me. You know, I grew up with the NES version. I played the NES version back in the day on my NES. And so maybe it's just, you know, visually the way it looks and the sound, the music and everything. Maybe that's just nostalgic for me, why I do prefer the NES version. But I think overall, yeah, the Sega Master System version probably is better. Of course, it was ported to a lot of other platforms. You know, it was ported to the Sega Genesis in '92. It was ported to, you know, a bunch of different 8-bit computers. Ported to Amiga and Atari ST. It was actually ported to the 2600 in 1988, so it was a late 2600 game. And I've actually played that on emulation, and it's pretty funny to see. It looks pretty good for an Atari 2600 game. It's pretty neat what they pulled off. But yeah, it was also ported to IBM PC and, you know, Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, Amstrad. It was ported to the Game Boy in 1990. I mean, it was ported to the Lynx. This thing was basically ported to everything at the time. You know, it was a popular game, no doubt about that. And, you know, it led to a couple of sequels. Well, many sequels, but on the NES, too, there's a couple sequels, too, so. Now, here's something they added to the NES version. Actually, this was not in the arcades. Is the 2-player one-on-one, you know, fighting mode. It's mode B on the main menu. And in here you have 2 players at once. You know, it's like a fighting game, Street Fighter 2. Of course, it's nothing like Street Fighter 2 without any special moves, but it's one-on-one fighting game. The graphics are awesome in this mode, but you'll notice that you can never play a different character. You're never fighting a different character. You're fighting the same character always, so it's once again a limitation to how many sprites it can draw on the screen. They have to be the same sprites in this case. Yeah, the 2-player mode is pretty neat, but, you know, it's basically what they threw in there because they couldn't give you the, you know, the main game with cooperative 2-player. So they gave you that instead, so at least you have something to play 2-player. You can play 2-player in the main game. I did not mention this, but what it does is it's basically like Super Mario Brothers. You know, when you die, it goes to player 2. Player 2 still plays as Billy, oddly enough. So, you know, they have two characters in this game, but Jimmy is not a playable character on the NES version. Player 2 still plays as Billy. It's just that when player 1 dies, player 2 gets to play from where he died, and then when player 2 dies, it goes back to player 1 where he died. Just like Super Mario 1, it's not 2-player simultaneously. So, that kind of sucks. I was really disappointed there on the NES version. But other than that, like I said, I really like the NES version. I think the music is awesome. I personally like the graphics, even if they are maybe a little bit better on the Master System. You know, like I said, if you're not looking specifically for the 2-player, you know, either version's good. But if you want the 2-player, pick up the Master System version.